Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce today's seminar speaker. Claire Kremen is a professor of biodiversity in the Department of Environmental Sciences, Policy and Management at UC Berkeley. And before that, she was an assistant professor here at Princeton in ecology and evolutionary biology. And before that, she was a scientist at the Wildlife Conservation Society, as well as being their Madagascar Country Program Director, which I hope gives you a sense of just how diverse her background and interests are. Claire is a conservation biologist, and I think by any measure, one of the most influential conservation biologists in the world today. And her work really has two complementary lines of research. One focuses on the conservation of biodiversity essentially for its own sake, for its intrinsic value, and that has led to some really path-breaking papers on reserve design with a focus on Madagascar, as well as conservation planning research that was highly influential for being one of the first such studies to begin to put an economic valuation on both the natural products and the ecosystem services associated with various options for protecting areas. That's one line of research. The second line of research focuses on protecting the ecosystem services, that is the non-monetized, or frequently non-monetized benefits that people derive from biodiversity. And Claire is deeply interested in understanding how we can best go about conserving those ecosystem services. And that line of research in turn has led to some very innovative and important papers over the years on pollination systems and crops, as well as a growing interest in addressing some broader questions relating to the sustainability of contemporary agriculture. The work that she does combines fundamental ecology, conservation biology, and often economics, all at varying spatial scales, which makes it both important and interesting. And not surprisingly, Claire has been the recipient of a number of honors, including a MacArthur Fellowship in 2007. She was made a Fellow of the California Academy of Sciences in 2013, and in 2014 was the recipient of the Pritzlaff Conservation Award. Next fall, Claire will be leaving Berkeley and assuming a new position as President's Distinguished Professor at the University of British Columbia. A big loss for Berkeley, a big gain for UBC. It's wonderful to have you back here. Ladies and gentlemen, Claire Kremen.
Well, thank you so much, David, for that generous introduction and for inviting me, and I hope I can live up to the promise that you have made here. It's always delightful to be at Princeton and to be back here and see new and old friends, meet new friends and see old ones. And today what I want to talk to you about is largely along the lines of a review paper that just came out a couple of weeks ago in Science that I've written with my colleague Adina Marenlander, who also has a Princeton connection. I'm going to take you down a little memory lane walk of my own. Many years ago, when fresh out of graduate school, my first conservation assignment essentially was I was fortunate enough to go to Madagascar and work with Dr. Patricia Wright, who at the time was establishing the Ranamafan National Park in Madagascar, and I helped her in that task. And then shortly thereafter, I moved a little bit north in Madagascar to the Mashwala Peninsula, a vast area of rainforest that was at the time quite undiscovered and unknown. And George Schatz in the room is one of the people who knows it deeply, especially the plants. But they're working with many different conservation organizations. We ultimately established Madagascar's largest national park, the Parc National Mashwal. And then and several years later, working with many, many scientists across the country, we pulled together data that helped to inform Madagascar's blueprint for conservation that essentially has been implemented since then. So at that time, the protected area paradigm, which I briefly define as separating nature from humans to protect biodiversity, that protected area paradigm was really alive and well, and I was very deeply embedded in that protected area paradigm. But since then, when I came back to the United States and began to work in California, studying crop pollinators and native pollinators and their contributions to crop pollination, I often was working along a spectrum of agricultural diversification, from very diversified farms, such as you see at the top, to very simplified and chemically intensive monoculture farms in California. And it was then that I began to realize what an impact intensive agriculture was having on biodiversity in a large portion of the planet, whether protected or not. And this and other things have led me to question this protected area paradigm. This is data from colleagues in Germany showing that even within protected areas, the biomass of insects, just the whole lump sum of all insects that can be collected in a passive sampling device, a Malaise trap, that biomass over the past quarter century has plummeted, by 76%. It's an amazing result. And what could be the cause of this? Land use change around these protected areas has not really been changing, but agriculture has become more intensive. So most likely, these changes within protected areas in something as fundamental as insect biomass are due to these the increasing use and the changing use of pesticides, as well as probably climate change. But this is deeply concerning, that the little things that run the world, these insects across the board, are declining. And not only insects, but when we look also at declining vertebrate species over the past 100 years, about 30% of 27,000 vertebrate species are in decline. But again, what is most disturbing to me is that of those 30% of declining species, yet another 30% are actually common species. The green bars there are species of what we would call low concern, but they are also declining. So even species that are incredibly widespread, with large populations, like the common barn swallow, are in decline. This seems to indicate problems that are too widespread to rely on protected areas alone, and very fundamental disruptions of the fabric of nature. So we come to the working lands conservation concept. So what are working lands? Specifically, these are managed landscapes in which humans are producing food, fiber, fuel, forage, and forest products. So they consist of both cultivated lands, like farmlands, but also semi-natural lands, like rangelands, that might be grazed, or some products are being extracted from them. So in the working lands conservation concept, the idea is protecting biodiversity in spaces that are shared by people and nature. So how can we take these working lands and make them a positive for conservation and complement to protected areas? We need forms of sustainable management on these working lands that can lead to multifunctional production of an array of goods and services, so that we can have productivity from these lands, an array of products, forest products, livestock products, crops. But we also need to make sure that we're sustaining the ecosystem services that underlie sustainable production systems, and that in working lands conservation, we also want these lands to provide habitat for biodiversity directly, as well as to serve as more connected and more permeable landscapes that help to reduce the isolation of protected areas. So working lands conservation should aim for sustainability in its broadest sense of the 3 E's, environment, economy, and equity, and should aim also for providing resilience to disturbances which are becoming, of course, increasingly frequent as we have global changes. And biodiversity is both a desired outcome, but also a key component to promote that sustainability and that resilience. Okay, so this is sort of my conceptual framework that I'm working towards. In this talk, what I'd like to do is cover 3 areas. First, why we need working lands conservation to complement and increase the effectiveness of protected areas. And I want to again underscore that protected areas, in my view, are key to biodiversity conservation. Working lands conservation is an additional thing that we need. Second, can working lands conservation simultaneously promote biodiversity and be productive, sustainable, and resilient at scale? It's asking a lot. Can we have these win-win situations? And then finally, what are the barriers and what tools and trends exist to scale up adoption of working lands conservation? So starting with this first piece about working lands as complements and their potential for increasing the effectiveness of protected areas. The first reason is simply that our working lands, where we grow food and produce forest products, et cetera, they make up the bulk of terrestrial lands. And so if we can manage them correctly, they could provide much potential habitat. This graph here shows how land area, global land area is distributed among, you see croplands, that's 12%, pasture lands are 23%, those are already working lands. While it's difficult to come up with an estimate of how much of forested woodlands or savanna grasslands are already working lands, are already being used to produce these goods for people, I would estimate that at least half of them are, which means that we come up to over 50% of the lands on Earth are already working lands, which have then, if we could implement working lands conservation, this potential. And this is compared to how many lands we have as protected. It's about 15% at this point. But interestingly, only a portion of those protected areas are strictly protected, that is in IUCN categories 1 through 4. IUCN categories 5 and 6 make up the remainder, a little bit more than half. And those categories refer to lands that have traditional management practices or that have some sort of habitat use. So those are already essentially in working lands conservation. So simply the bulk of area is outside of protected areas. And so we really need to be managing this also for biodiversity. A second reason is that we know when we go and look that many species actually already do utilize working lands as a habitat or partial habitat. This data is from Chase Mendenhall's work in Costa Rica. The gray bars there show for a number of different taxonomic groups that many species that exist in the forest also make use of agricultural landscapes outside of the forest. So there's quite a lot to be gained by managing these lands for such species that can use these agricultural matrices. But bearing in mind, those green bars there are also very important. Those are the forest restricted species that never would make use of these agricultural habitats. And again, that underscores the need for strictly protected areas. Another reason is that some habitat types are only maintained through actual working lands management. So for example, especially in Europe, there are 23 habitat types that require traditional mowing or grazing. I show 2 examples there. The Dehesa forests of Spain are oak forests, oak and cork forests that are managed actually for, I believe it's pig and production. But they're very, very biodiverse, and they also support some endangered species, including the Iberian lynx. The North Atlantic wet heath in the United Kingdom is also managed by grazing, and again supports endangered species like the Alcon blue butterfly. And migratory animals often stray outside of protected areas. This slide here shows the Yellowstone region, the Yellowstone National Park. And these little squiggly lines represent different elk herds. They spend their summers in Yellowstone Park, but during the winter time, they head for lower elevations, where they often leave the boundaries of the park and are existing on both public and private working lands that are also rangelands. And working lands conservation could be critical for buffering protected areas. The work of Bill Laurence showed that across the tropics, biodiversity inside reserves that were more influenced by fire and deforestation and logging outside of the reserves was suffering. So dealing with these kinds of effects outside of the reserves is critical to maintaining the biodiversity within them. And then we have the issue of isolation. So these two graphics are modeled based on studies of mammals on the left with a red graph, and tropical bird species on the right. Islands or fragments of natural habitat are going to lose species over time, and these models based on empirical data show that the time till the loss of 50% of the species in the solid lines is very much dependent on the size of the isolated fragment. Even the largest national parks are losing species due to isolation, and that will continue. So I popped up a couple of more familiar landmarks just to give you an idea. So even some very large parks like Yellowstone National Park are going to lose species in the order of 50% of species within several thousand years. So it's important to try to reduce this by restoring connectivity, restoring linkages. And the classic approach to doing this is through actual habitat restoration. This is an example from the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil, which is a highly fragmented region and of great biodiversity richness and endemism. And in this area, Will Newmark and colleagues have found that if you could add 12 small linkages totaling only 2.6 kilometers squared, you could relink these areas and create a much larger contiguous area of 2,000 kilometers squared and increase the time to the loss of species, 50% of the species, by 13 times. So that's the classic way, through actual restoration. But if we dig into this a little bit more and we look at this landscape, you see how incredibly dissected and fragmented it actually is. Yes, restoration can happen. It is arduous. Here's an example of restoration from that region. But what about the idea of managing the working landscape in a much broader area and creating a much more permeable and larger, in essence, corridors and linkages, which we could do through favorable land management practices like silvopasture and agroforestry. And again, enhancing the effectiveness of protected areas. And the final reason is that, of course, we have the specter of climate change. And recent analyses have shown that it's likely that most protected areas are actually going to lose much of their current climate characteristics, which just underscores the need to develop this habitat connectivity among protected areas and allow much more movement and permeability. So just to summarize this portion of why working lands can be so helpful to complement protected areas by increasing the area for biodiversity in the first place, supporting species that can already use such managed landscapes, and the habitats and species that depend on traditional management practices, and helping to support migratory species. In terms of effectiveness, buffering protected areas from external threats, and increasing the permeability of landscapes in a much broader way than narrow corridors could do to help combat the problems of fragmentation and climate change. So let me move now on to the notion of whether, to ask the question, can working lands conservation simultaneously promote biodiversity and be productive, sustainable, and resilient at scale? So there are a huge array of different management practices that can be used on working lands, or cultivated lands, rangelands, or forest lands. What I want to do is just talk about a suite of practices and how you can add diversification to these practices in, let's say, farmland. So you could start with the very simplest kind of row crop monoculture. You could diversify it by adding in rotations, diversify it further by having more complex rotations or adding intercropping, add in polycultures and livestock, integrate livestock into the system, add trees into the system with agroforestry, and finally end up with incredibly diversified home gardens, which are literally hundreds of different fruit tree species and other crops. So we have, a spectrum of diversification, and often we can array for each of these different types of working lands along a spectrum of diversification, and we see that as we do that, the chemical intensification goes in the other direction. So these monoculture systems tend to be very chemically dependent, both in terms of fertilizers and also pesticides. So what I want to talk about next is I will walk through 3 vignettes to give you an idea of some of these more diversified practices and how they compare to the more simplified practices along these aspects of biodiversity, productivity, sustainability, and resilience. And then I will finish with a meta-analysis. So the first one comes from my own work. Here we're looking at how you can rediversify the Great Central Valley of California, one field edge at a time. This is a massive agricultural region, one of the most intensively farmed in the world, and most of the fields are very, very large and consist of a single crop type, although across an array of fields we have many different crop types. This is an example of a diversification practice that some farmers are taking up. These are conventional growers using monoculture, but they grow these native plant hedgerows often to attract beneficial insects that might help them in their production system. They're also sometimes interested in providing habitat for game birds because they want to do a little hunting in the weekends. Or they might be interested in soil conservation, water quality issues, weed control, or simply the aesthetics. So I'm going to be showing you a radar diagram for each of these systems that I'm showing you. In these radar diagrams, the dark blue is always going to be the more diversified practice, and the orange is always going to be the more simplified practice. So here we're comparing hedgerow edges with control bare edges, weedy edges, whatever happens to be growing. So let's look first. We see that there are big benefits in terms of bird species richness, also bee species richness, and the abundance of the less common bee species in the hedgerow edges compared to their controls. In terms of productivity, we found actually a positive benefit to production with canola seeds, and this was actually due to the increases in pollinator diversity and abundance that led to enhanced pollination in canola, a highly pollinator-dependent plant. But in another highly pollinator-dependent plant, sunflower, we did not see any increase, so this was just a neutral effect. In terms of sustainability, we also found positive benefits for pest control and pest control insects. Another component of sustainability, and I'll be using these 2 different ways of looking at sustainability, the maximizing ecosystem services, but also minimizing externalities. So on these fields, because of the enhanced pest control, farmers were able to actually reduce the amount of times that they used pesticides and thus their own costs. Scaling up to landscape, so on the left diagram you see our hedgerow sites in the dark colors, and the control sites are in the red color. Not going into any great detail here, we've looked not only at how the hedgerows affect the pollinator communities themselves locally, but also how the whole network of hedgerows contributes to the pollinator population dynamics and species turnover. And so what we found is that the hedgerow network enhances turnover among hedgerows relative to controls. And what this basically means is that the hedgerows are more dissimilar to one another than control sites are dissimilar to one another. The control sites support a small number of generalized species, and the hedgerows support a greater number of specialists, but they also differ from one another, contributing more to regional richness. And Ray Winfrey at Rutgers University has recently shown that this turnover is actually quite important for pollination services. The second aspect is that these hedgerows work together to enhance the populations, not just locally, but the meta-population, that is the collection of populations across all of the hedgerows, and enhances their persistence and occupancy. And so ultimately this helps to lead to the resistance to extinction by these pollinator populations. So we have a very small land area that's being used here, but it has a big conservation benefit. And in terms of resilience, I know that you've all heard about the problems with honeybees in this country. Colony collapse disorder and colony losses are exacerbated. This causes problems for beekeepers. And we've shown through a series of studies that having more pollinators around is really a great insurance policy to help shore up the problems of when we have the lack of pollinators to provide crop pollination services. So I'm going to move now to this second vignette, which is on silvopastoral systems in the dry tropics. This is not my work, but other people's work. And in these systems, the silvopastoral systems include grasses, grasses here that are planted, planted nitrogen fixing, you see the little nodules down here, shrubs that are also palatable and provide forage for the cattle, and finally fruit trees and other kinds of trees that provide shade, and the fruit is also actually eaten by the cattle as well. So in these systems, the idea is that compared to grass monocultures, these are more productive. They produce more biomass. It leads to healthy meat and milk production. They're also more regenerative in the sense that the cattle are producing manure that's being recycled. The nitrogen-fixing plants are fixing nitrogen. The trees are fixing carbon into the soil. And so you have improved pasture, but you also have some ability to provide greenhouse gas mitigation. The deeper roots of the trees are helping water to infiltrate into the soil, which helps to provide water conservation and deal with droughts. And so it's a much more regenerative system. So looking at some of the data from this system, again, we have the silvopastoral system in blue compared with grass monocultures. And let's start with productivity. Interestingly, quite substantial gains in daily milk production and daily weight gain, and not only that, in stocking rate. So I think it's a 3-to-1 stocking rate increase, which means that in the terms of minimizing externalities, one of the most important externalities for biodiversity is the large area that is taken up with livestock production, whether it's direct for pasturing or indirectly in terms of producing grains that are destined for feeding cattle. This is one of the biggest impacts on biodiversity. So in the silvopastoral system, because of the higher stocking rates, the land area per ton of meat is actually much reduced in the silvopastoral system. So this is a huge way of minimizing that externality. And in addition, the methane per ton of meat is also reduced, and the nitrogen fertilizer use. Moving on to other sustainability aspects, maximizing ecosystem services. These systems help with tick control and are also carbon sequestration, allowing the reduction in the use of pesticides. And finally, there's some evidence that they do support elements of biodiversity that would not be found in the grass monoculture, although certainly there are forest-restricted species that are not found in these silvopastoral systems. Again, they're not a substitute for parks, but a complement. Here's an example of using silvopastoral systems to restore degraded lands in Colombia, where this is really taking off. And so what you see in the background with the blue dashed lines is a planted silvopasture that has those elements I mentioned. It has the grasses, it has the nitrogen-fixing leucine shrub, and also eucalyptus trees that provide shade. In the foreground here, you see very degraded soils that had formerly been used for intensive agriculture. They've planted them with grasses, but are allowing tropical forest regeneration to occur. In this region here, it's also used for silvopasture, but this is native tropical dry forest. Some years later, we see the same area. Just to orient you, this is the planted area that I showed you before with the long lines of eucalyptus. In the foreground is the area that had been reseeded with grasses. You see much more tropical dry forest creeping in. In the back here is a newly seeded area, and you can see that as these patches start to build together, they also connect with a riparian corridor here, and so they're scaling up this system that is actually building connectivity back into the landscape. In terms of resilience, in times of drought, then these systems seem to be better able to produce the forage that's needed to keep the animals healthy. The shade helps to deal with heat stress and also to deal with pest outbreaks. So my third vignette, even in the US Corn Belt, the most intensively farmed, arguably, area in the world, there are amazing people trying to rediversify this landscape. My colleague Lisa Schulte-Moore is spearheading this work. And here what you see are these tiny strips of prairie that have been integrated into a corn monoculture. And this is 10% of the land that's been taken out of production. Getting down into one of these prairie strips, you can see it here, bringing back some interesting birds, the dickcissel. And you see the plants and the insects in this close-up slide. So they've done really great work documenting the effects on a variety of components. So in terms of biodiversity, not surprisingly because it's planted, we have great increases in the native plant richness on the prairie strips, the blue there, but also pollinator richness, pollinator abundance greatly enhanced compared to the 100% crop. So here what we're looking at are the crop fields with 10% allocated to prairie versus 100% crop. Bird richness also enhanced, but not just all birds. Bird abundance for the species of greater conservation concern is also enriched. In terms of sustainability here, they're really quite amazing. Important effects, considering that only 10% of the crop is being removed. Of course, the big issues there are water quality issues, are enormously problematic. But because these prairie strips help to reduce runoff, they also have an enormous effect on reducing sediment loss, reducing phosphorus loss, and I believe it's non-significant, but there is a trend towards reduction of nitrogen loss as well. And then finally, in terms of productivity, yes, there is a trade-off with productivity. 10% of the land is taken out of production, and it's about that amount of reduction in productivity as well. But interestingly, the profitability turned out not to be significantly different, although again, a trend towards a reduction. And that is a serious problem. Farmers aren't going to do this if it's not profitable. There's no incentive. One of the things that the research group there is playing with is looking at how lands are typically managed. Generally, the status quo management is to treat all acreage the same. But what if you take a look at this field and decided, well, maybe this wet area in the front should not be planted to crop. It could be instead restored to a wet prairie. How would that affect the economics? And in fact, what they found is that this, using this idea of targeting the marginal areas for prairie reconstruction, ultimately could potentially save people money because they tend to lose a bit of money. And this is, using precision farming, now it's actually quite feasible to detect how much production you're doing on each bit of land. So taking these lands out of production can actually end up saving them money, breaking even in good years or avoiding losses in bad years. Scaling up the potential for this, for Iowa shows a map of where these researchers have found these environmental benefits could be realized based on slope characteristics and other characteristics. And it turns out it's about 30% of Iowa's land, or 3.9 million hectares. And again, this targeted siting within the fields might make it economically attractive. Many farmers are interested, about 15% want them, and 40% want to learn more. So it's potentially realizable. I just wanted to mention also that this is not the only thing that's happening in the Corn Belt. This book just recently came out. It's called Wildly Successful Farming, and it's journalistic stories of about 12 farmers that are doing crazy different things in this area, including Tyler Carson in Minnesota, who's actually got a silvopastoral system going. He's doing intensive rotational grazing on former croplands, but he's also doing silvopasture within an oak savanna to maintain that oak savanna area. And then Dan Jennings also in Minnesota, is what he's doing is using cover cropping of non-native plants to then establish native grasses and forbs for rotational grazing. And relative to resilience in the Midwest, so here you see a scientist, this is also from Brian's book, who's demonstrating with cover cropping how this influences the soil. You can see that dark, rich area of topsoil there that the cover cropping is helping to produce. And then on the right, you see this prairie plant with this incredible root system compared to, that would be a perennial bunch grass prairie compared to an annual grass system. And the difference in the root system is amazing, and that's what really can hold that soil in, and is really why those prairie strips are so effective at minimizing these incredible pollutants that are coming off those soy and corn fields. But finally, in terms of resilience, I mean, this is anecdotal, but farmers who cover cropped and then left the cover crop residue on the field, as you see in the top, you can see this is the cover crop residue, were able to resist the drought of 2012 compared to farmers that did not and had their fields literally dry up in front of their eyes. And you can look at this soil here too. It's very impermeable. It's very difficult for the water to act, when there is rain, for that water to actually get into the soil through so much soil compaction and so much loss of soil organic matter. So finally, to the meta-analysis, which is work in progress. Here what we've done is we've looked, it's actually a meta-analysis of meta-analyses, and for those of you who don't look at these all the time, basically what we're looking at here is the comparison of a more diversified practice from a number of different types of diversified practices. So this is lumping them all together. But the more diversified practice compared to the more simplified practice. And we're looking at a number of different ecosystem services in the blue, biodiversity in green, and then production in the orange. And when we see the mean effect size and its standard error, when that is to the right of 0, that means that the diversified practice is having a stronger positive effect on those ecosystem services, biodiversity, or production. And when it's crossing 0, then it's a non-significant effect. In this case, we don't have any significant negative effects, but we see some significant positive effects on a number of the ecosystem services: water regulation, soil fertility, nutrient cycling. We also see positive effects on biodiversity here. And what is, I think, the most important result is that it's not accompanied with a trade-off with production. It's a neutral effect on production. So there's a neutral effect on production. So, you know, why wouldn't you want to enhance your ecosystem services, reduce your externalities if there isn't a cost to production? That's what we're looking for here. So to sum up this section, our case studies exemplify how these win-win situations, for the most part, how diversification can promote elements of biodiversity and some ecosystem services, enhancing sustainability and resilience without destroying productivity or profitability. Mechanisms also exist in each of these cases for scaling up these effects from the farm to the landscape scale for greater impact. And the meta-analysis suggests that these results may be more generalizable. But of course, and I'm sure you're all thinking, well, why isn't this happening if this is so great? Why don't we have this on our landscapes? Of course, many barriers exist. So this brings me to the last portion of my talk. Really, it's going the other direction. It has been for a long time. This is large scale. This is palm oil plantation in Indonesia. A recent study showed that much of deforestation is caused by large scale commodity cropping. It's 60%. Over 60% in both Asia and Latin America over the past, since 2001. So how do we reverse this trend more towards working lands conservation? So barriers to adoption, there are many. And I think one of the most important is often there's a bit of a cost to get this going. So, and that can be a huge barrier. The access to credit is necessary. Certainly that's the case in the silvopastoral system. Change is hard, people are risk averse, there are a lot of lock-in factors. That is certainly the case with the hedgerow system, where people are concerned that they might run into regulatory problems if these hedgerows not only brought benefits to their farms, but also perhaps vectored in rodents or something that might cause food safety problems. And there are trade-offs, as we saw with the prairie strips. Access to land is huge. If farmers can't access land, they don't have the money. In California, land is very expensive. Then they can't purchase the land themselves. They're renting. There's no incentive for the long-term investments that these kinds of techniques really require. Access to labor, often these techniques are more labor intensive, and that can be a barrier if the labor simply isn't there. And they're knowledge intensive. It really helps if there are farmer-to-farmer networks that will bring information to farmers, or if the government extension is there. But often the agribusiness sales reps are the ones that are the most dominant in these landscapes in terms of providing information. Access to appropriate equipment, seeds, breeds, trees, if you're planting trees, certainly these are important. And then the lack of incentives from policy or regulation, or even disincentives. I mentioned food safety. In this country, the food safety regulations and the pressures that are coming from the corporate buyers for food safety tend to be disincentives for this more wildlife-friendly farming. But there are a lot of tools available for working lands conservation. And in this graphic, we're showing how they vary from those that are more applicable to private lands versus public lands. So this is sort of our set of existing working lands conservation policies and tools. So things like conservation easements, management incentives like our Farm Bill programs, the Conservation Reserve Program, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program can help private landowners use some of these techniques on their land, payments for ecosystem service programs, and moving on up towards more communal, community-based natural resource management, often a combination of public and private interests in these kinds of systems. And then even towards protected areas themselves. I mentioned the IUCN category 5 and 6, where traditional land management practices are already part of these protected areas, and indigenous conserved areas where indigenous people are living in these areas and using the resources are on the more public end of the spectrum. And of course, there are many, many problems with these tools. There are no panacea. I don't have time to go through all the problems, but I do just want to talk about one, and that is that, especially with private lands conservation, often these approaches might be applied in a very piecemeal approach that will not be very beneficial to biodiversity. For example, we have a few conservation easements over here and a few more over here, but they're tiny and fragmented and don't add up to much of a real large enough area or that can benefit biodiversity. But some promising solutions to that are landscape level initiatives that are starting to coordinate the activities of private landowners to make the whole much larger than the sum of the parts. And an example of this is a really fabulous and ambitious initiative in Australia called the Great Eastern Range Corridor Initiative. They actually have a few of these. And they're thought of as climate corridors. The light green area in the slide shows the area that has been laid out as necessary for some sort of conservation, but it's not going to be all through protected areas. There are some protected areas embedded in there. But instead, each of these buttons with the numbers indicates a different alliance between natural resource conservation managers, government agencies, and communities, including land care communities, that are involved in actual restoration on the ground and working lands management practices. So this is really developing this climate corridor is going to be a huge patchwork of different community engagements and different working lands management practices along with protected areas. There are also, I think, positive social trends that we see for scaling up working lands conservation. And one is that so many nonprofit organizations, conservation organizations, are adopting these kind of sustainable land management practices and coming up with some interesting innovations in doing this. There's also a lot of conservation investment, meaning that financial institutions themselves are investing more and more in enterprises that will co-generate conservation gains along with return on investment, particularly in the areas of sustainable food and fiber, which is right within the working lands conservation framing, and also in habitat conservation itself. And then finally, social movements. We see growing effects of social movements on markets, on corporations, influencing these in terms of policies and also in the land management that they themselves do. So I want to conclude by noting that, really, when we think about the problem of biodiversity loss, unsustainable resource extraction and consumption is really the main driver, of course, and both directly but also indirectly through its contribution to climate change. And so any kind of solution to biodiversity loss has to take this into account. Obviously, we need to reduce this incredible driver. We need to reduce consumption, and that's not an easy task. But through working lands management, we can also try to make the human-dominated areas of the Earth more friendly to biodiversity conservation and more sustainable by promoting ecosystem services. And often these kinds of techniques can also help to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And of course, we need to continue to protect protected areas and even expand those. But this can be complemented by using working lands to reduce isolation and buffer the threats to parks. So I'll finish there and just thank my colleague Adina Marenlander, who helped me with this review. And of course, I've presented the work of many, many colleagues here, and the citations are all there. So thank you very much. I hope I have a bit of time for questions.
Thank you very much, Claire. We do have time for some questions. If you have questions, please raise your hand.
One question was about the eucalyptus. I think of eucalyptus way out where you are is kind of a controversial tree that is reduced to anything that
Yes.
goes underneath it because of all the toxins it releases. So
Yeah,
I'm
that's a good
wondering
question.
why they're using that tree to supposedly promote rangeland.
Yeah, I don't actually know the answer to that. I don't like eucalyptus. I have a big patch of them growing right behind my house and raining leaves into my garden and being a fire hazard. So yeah, I really can't answer that question. I don't know why they're using eucalyptus there. I just know that they are. They do plant them north-south. That's to not compete with the grasses and forage shrubs. It's certainly not the only tree that is being used in silvopastoral systems. But it's a good question. I hadn't thought about the toxins. It doesn't seem to be a problem there, but I don't know why. So I'll have to look into that. Thank you. Yes?
Thanks for talking. I was just wondering, in terms of the land holding of farmers, this may not be a problem in the developed countries.
Yeah.
Most of the developing countries, they have small land holdings.
Yes.
So is there any calculation or thoughts on what is the minimum size of land holding for a farmer when this trade-off between diversification and productivity?
Great question. I don't know specifically about the size of the land holding, but one thing that I can say is I think that this approach is actually extremely good for smallholder farmers because there has been quite a bit of work done. And it's quite large scale, and it ranges in many developing countries where people have brought together these data and have shown that most of these diversifying techniques can also be thought of as resource conserving techniques, that term has been used, help to boost productivity for the small-scale farmer relative to their current situation. So I want to be clear that that doesn't mean that relative to conventional agriculture with a full array of fertilizers and pesticides that would necessarily be better in terms of yield, but relative to subsistence farmers and business as usual, these tend to increase yields, increase livelihoods in a variety of ways. So I think that they're actually very well adapted to the smallholder farmer, perhaps in some ways more so than, in the large-scale systems that we have here, probably the best that you could hope for is some small tweaks, like adding these hedgerows or maybe putting 10% of your land into prairie strips. You're still going to probably have very large, intensive systems that are relatively chemically dependent. But in the smallholder situation, I think that you could quite plausibly go the other direction and intensify the production on the land that they have, making it more high yielding. But again, you have to get over that activation energy of it needs a bit of credit. So that, I think that's why it's not happening. Thanks for the question. Henry.
In Central California, what are the prospects, either from the research point of view or from the management point of view, for taking that large-scale checkerboard and simply making it smaller squares or making it script-wise diverse?
I mean, I would love to see that, but I think the prospects are probably not so great. I think that a lot of what drives the large-scale nature of these systems is, well, it goes back in history because there was large land grants were given, so it's an ownership unit. But also, I can't think of the right word, but it's really, you know, the companies that are buying the stuff, they want to drive a big semi-truck up to a field and collect a lot of the same thing at once. So it's the transaction costs that are associated with, you know, dealing with lots of small producers, I think that restrict that. That being said, there's certainly a lot of growers in California that are highly diversified. What I see happening is they're really going to different markets. So the diversified growers tend to sell direct to restaurants, to farmers markets. They do community-supported agriculture boxes, those kinds of things. Or they get aggregated. Sometimes they're aggregators. But the big monoculture folks, whether they're organic or conventional, doesn't matter. They're going, you know, they're being purchased by Costco or, you know, Walmart or all of those big box stores. So, yeah.
Is there any evidence that preserving 10% of the cropland in, say, Midwest helps to restore the monarch butterfly populations? Has anybody looked at that as a way of preserving those populations?
Somebody has looked at how much it would take to provide enough prairie plants, or well, basically milkweed, for the monarch to bring it back to levels, and it looked like it would be maybe if every single field had 10%, that might do it. They didn't put it in those terms, but it was a really large land area. They were looking at marginal lands, though, and it was saying that there would be a huge effort to do this, but if most of the marginal lands in the Midwest could be restored to prairie, yeah, we'd have enough milkweed to bring the monarch population back to levels. It was a paper by Thog Martin. Or I can send it to you. Yeah.
Imagine quite a few people in the room read the palm oil article in the Times just yesterday or today.
I did not read it. I did not see the newspaper yesterday.
It is so disheartening.
Yeah.
And the question, but you know.
I know about, yeah. I mean, I have that slide.
It does need.
Yeah.
I had tuned out and looked at this. So why did they recommend you had to do something about palm oil and kind of taking it back and truly, on the also?
Yeah, it's very disheartening.
Every possible chipping away from what orangutan.
Right.
And applying what you told us to that problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we really have to stop we cannot continue to expand into pristine landscapes. It just has to stop. To any kind of pristine, so what I'm suggesting is that we use already degraded lands, already used lands for working lands conservation. We not allow any additional new deforestation, any deforestation of primary forest or even mature secondary forest.
Implementation has been established.
Right.
That's clear. Is there anything from your frame of reference that possibly go from there?
I don't know a huge amount about palm oil agriculture, so I don't know to what extent you could diversify it, but possibly, yeah. I also don't know how much chemicals they use in it. But probably they do have pests and do use a lot. So I can't give you a lot of detail there. Because I think what you're asking is, could we make those lands that have already converted to palm oil, could we create a more favorable,
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great question.
Or any other well,
Yeah.
another way.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any answer to that? Because you work in those landscapes.
Yeah, Leon Pinto, former graduate student here, looked at that issue looked at what you get by feeding some bits and pieces of native forest in the plantations, putting some flowering plants in the understory. And the bottom line was that at least for groups like birds and butterflies, it didn't make much of a difference. The one thing that you can do is leave a buffer of non-palm oil vegetation forest along streams. It doesn't have to be that wide a buffer. You can protect the stream community. And that was found by a fellow named Singli Dion, who's another graduate student here. But it's, you could probably do something akin to what Schulte's doing in the Corn Belt, and you might get some benefits, but nothing relative to what you've lost by converting forest to oil palm. And we don't know much about restoring old oil palm plantations because there aren't many old oil palm plantations.
It takes them a long time to get old. I mean, they've got to be, what, 30 years? And then they recut them, too.
They cut it, mulch, and 30 replant.
So they last a long time. But, you know, I think there we got to hold the line. And, you know, and there's some idea that keeping some small patches of forest within these oil palm landscape might be beneficial, but actually Matt Luskin has shown that that is probably not the case, and that those may end up being more sinks. So not necessarily a good trade-off in that case. So there are definitely landscapes where this approach maybe is not going to work. Yeah.
So two questions. One is, what do you find is the real evidence for the benefits of corridors? And I've been involved in trying to restore them, but I haven't had a sense that we have a lot of evidence about people who actually use them. And the second question is, what's your sense of what's really driving the decline of insect populations? How much of it, have any sense of how much is pesticides versus how much of it is loss of small levels?
Yeah. So the first question, I don't think there's a huge amount of evidence on corridors, but I think, and when you say corridors, you're talking about the classic corridors of actually restored habitat.
For example, if you
recreate a linkage,
that really work?
But I mean, even less is available on increasing connectivity in the way that I'm suggesting to create these, what I'm calling more permeable landscapes. So that is truly a huge research gap. It's actually where I want my research program to go in the future, to see to what extent something like agroforestry or silvopasture could actually reconnect things. So it's a useful landscape, but also it's a lot wider than these narrow corridors. So I think the jury is still out. It's something we need to test. And the second question was about the insects. Well, I think insecticides have a huge amount to do with it. I mean, the amount of the insect, you look at the graphs of insecticide use, it's gone up and up and up. The kinds of insecticides have changed, but I don't think their potential effects of, they're getting more targeted towards insects. So I think that is probably the key driver. Now recently, I haven't read the article, but there was an article out in the New York Times about effects on sperm counts in insects and climate and temperature extremes, so maybe that's something that's happening too. But in the German case, they specifically looked at land use change around these protected areas. They are very small protected areas, so the situation could be different in a very large protected area, but because they're very small, they're very exposed to, the sorts of pesticide drift, et cetera, that you might expect to see. So.
Well, Claire, thank you so much for wonderful